Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cassidy Diamond. I am the Public Programs and Events Manager here at the International Documentary Association. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation around Some Kind of Heaven, moderated by IndieWire's Anne Thompson. We're super excited to get started. But before we do, I'm just going to start out, as we always do, with a brief land acknowledgement. Today, I am coming to you from Chicago, which is on the unceded land of the three Fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. I'd also like to thank IndieWire for their support of our series and for support from KCRW as well. They really help us bring this series to all of you. And we have many more screenings and conversations coming up through the end of January. To find out more about them, you can visit documentary.org/screening series. And without any further ado, I'm going to bring on Anne here to get our conversation started. Hi. Oh, we have to unmute.
This is my
As
ritual.
always.
Hello, IDA. And come on board, Lance. Hello, Gabe.
Hello. Hello, IDA. Hello, Anne.
So you live in Florida, as I recall. Tell us where you are and how you are identified in a way as a regional filmmaker.
That's a very fun question. Well, I mean, I feel like Florida is I'm currently in Florida. I'm from Florida. It's everybody's favorite or maybe least favorite schizoid state. I mean, it's, I think there's a lot to, growing up here, I kind of was very much entrenched in the kind of thinking that I feel like surrounds a lot of the folks who live in a place like the Villages. It's, like Florida's everyone's favorite escapist location. I feel like this is a very random reference, but when I think of like Dark City, the Alex Proyas movie, there's all this like sun-soaked stuff where you leave the city and you're in this beachfront, this endless kind of paradise. And I feel like growing up in Florida, I realized very quickly that the paradise can kind of become quickly a nightmare for a lot of people. And that was sort of the, experience I had growing up. My parents were foreclosure defense attorneys, and they kind of went from representing people who had homes to people who lost them. And that was in 2008, that was really when I started making films. So I kind of became very obsessed with, the locale and how, what happens when you spend too much time in the sun, how it kind of melts away your brain and, also your skin too, I guess.
Well, before we get to the rubber-skinned denizens of the Villages, I'm curious about your filmic upbringing, if you like, and how you gravitated toward studying film and doing documentaries, and who some of your influences were. I detect a little bit of Errol Morris, Gates of Heaven here, but perhaps I'm mistaken. Tell me.
Yeah, I feel like any person who makes documentaries, I'm sure you start off with like a steady diet of the great films. And I think when I look back to the movies that first made me want to make documentaries, I think of Burn in Florida or Gates of Heaven. There's one Frederick Wiseman film that just also stayed in my in sort of my brain for so long, which is this is the one that takes place at the zoo, and I saw that several times in college. I kind of was, very like pretty much when I grew up. I think the first documentary that I really became obsessed with was Dark Days, which took place in the subterranean, abandoned New York subway tunnels, and that was kind of the movie that made me think to myself, there is a lot of, you technically, I guess you could be homeless, but not necessarily houseless, because in that film you see so many folks who live in this really kind of quirky, eccentric place, but the film brought so much humanity to all of these characters and subjects that lived there. And when I think of other films too, and I think of like Chris Smith's films, especially Home Movie, which was one of the ones I became obsessed with like it's the same sort of thing. It was kind of a catalog of really eccentric subjects, but it never quite felt like a slideshow of a carnival. It felt like there was something deeper and more humanistic happening there.
You
Yeah.
definitely have managed to take a situation that could have been, you know, you're having some fun with it, with the Elaines. There's this great sequence where about 20 women identify themselves as Elaine. So that involved a certain kind of recognition and setup. You know, so you must have immersed yourself in this world and decided you were going to observe it, and then figured out how to put the things that you found interesting on film.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the film kind of came out from, I spent a lot of time in the villages without a camera and kind of just living there. You know, I grew up not very close to the villages. I grew up about 2.5 hours away.
Where exactly is it?
So it's about 85 miles outside of Orlando, which is in Central Florida. So, you know, I grew up hearing about the place, but I didn't know anyone. Despite like growing up near, you know, I live in a community that's like surrounded by retirement communities, so that terrain wasn't so foreign to me. But the Villages is a whole different ballgame because it's literally in the middle of nowhere. It's in swampland that has been transformed into this, you know, Americana of sorts. So the film kind of came out from, and I think what you're describing, when I first got there, I was just so amazed by the spectacle that there were clubs that existed like the Elaines and all these kinds of like, you know, beautiful distractions from the world that can kind of take your mind out. And, you know, you could just be in a place like Zumba Club for the rest of your life if you'd like to. These you know, painless sort of ways to spend your time. And I think you can kind of get a sense of that in the beginning of the film. And then as the film goes on, it becomes much more concerned with a few people who, you know, don't really exist in that mold.
Well, you are, of course, attracted to some of the dysfunctional outsiders, including a literal gate crasher who was a great character, a kind of a tragic character. But how did you pick them? That's my question. And you knew that on the one hand, you were presenting the Disneyland. What is it? Is it 130,000 people who live there,
Yeah, you
built
got it
up from
right.
about 800 once upon a time? Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, no, everyone's usually like 165. You know your numbers. I usually
I
get
take
that.
notes.
Yeah, it's a large place, and I think it was a very daunting thing, honestly. When I first got there, I had no idea how to make a film about the place, and it's hard even when you look at, you know, one of the films that I also was obsessed with was a film called Space Coast, which kind of is a Ross McElwee film. When he was
Of
making
Sherman's March fame.
Yes, and this is a film that is kind of outside of like the vernacular of the self-referential stuff. It was really like a observational portrait of a community that kind of like goes between these interstitial things of a community and then becomes more subjective to some of the characters that live there. You know, I think what became very clear to me spending so much time in the villages was initially what attracted me was this idea of looking at, you know, tons of people, hundreds of thousands of people who were kind of cocooning themselves in this, you know, paradise because they didn't want to have anything to do with our, you know, with a very bizarre and very kind of, you know, a lack of understanding of maybe what was going on in our country. They wanted to just be inside of a place that reminded them of something familiar. And I kind of initially wanted to explore the danger of that thinking and the way in which the vacation can turn, you know, into a nightmare. But I think when I spent time there, it became to me the only thing that really made sense was doing something that felt real and human, and you know, not a movie about partisan politics, not a movie that you know, attempted
Judged people.
Yeah, that judged people. I wanted to do something that felt real to a lot of people's experiences there, which, you know, while these people may be the subjects of the film, may not be the stereotypical villager, they I think their experiences of not fitting in all the time and you know, being in relationships that aren't equitable for them are things that really a lot of people experience there and outside of there too.
I loved the whole story about the dysfunctional couple where you have this sort of straight lady who's a good athlete and she's a nice woman who's trying to do the right thing and loved at some point her husband, and they have somehow fallen apart, and he's turned into this sort of mystical stone pothead guy, and he's charming. They're both very, likable, but it takes a very bizarre path, that story. You must have, in a weird way, as it was going on, said to yourself, ooh, this is getting, when he gets arrested, you gotta go, this is good.
Yeah, I mean, you're illustrating like a thing that is such a weird part of making documentaries, which is, something that you need to kind of take responsibility for and be cognizant of. But usually, sometimes there's a film that I'm forgetting the name of it said this, but it's a Rob Moss film. The Tourist is what it's called. I think he says something about, when the lives of your subjects get worse, the better your film can be. I don't necessarily subscribe to that completely, and I don't think he does either. But in this case, I mean,
there was a happy ending in this case.
Yeah, I think I think the one thing that was intense about making the film, and I would never have thought that this would happen when someone were to tell you were making a film about retirees in this Disneyland type of place. I would never have thought we would go, the film and the people we were following would get to the kind of dark places they went to. But I think being with them weirdly in those moments kind of, I think, made everyone feel better. It made me feel better. It made them feel better. We had this kind of really interesting collaborative working relationship where we were bearing witness to a lot of the stuff they were going through, but they were able to also perform as well.
Exactly. So this raises a whole other question of how your interaction with your subjects impacts the way they behave. I find that always very interesting, and I wondered about that with that couple,
I think
especially.
There's definitely attention to that in this film, and I think to me, what became immediately clear when we were going to the villages was that every time there was an attempt that on our part to kind of do something more fly on the wall, where we would shoot some attempt at verite, and then we could, try and figure out to make a story of it in the edit. It never worked because I think so many people, for one, I think, I'm a few generations younger than most people who live there. So I already was sort of sticking out like a sore thumb. Two, having a camera and kind of dropping it into certain locations, sometimes you just have to ask yourself, what is the most appropriate and the best way to kind of cinematically take people on an experience that can really impart, what a setting feels like, or what a certain sensibility or a feeling could feel like. And getting to know the subjects, especially with Reggie and Anne, I think shooting the film in this sort of way required a lot of trust. And I think, when we showed them the film, and I still talk to them like once every 2 weeks, it kind of bonded us for life in a way. It was like, they were more creative collaborators or something than they were simply just, existing, I guess.
Well, it almost feels, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, as if Anne, is that her name? I should remember that name. It feels like she almost recognized that the presence of the camera could be an effective way to sort of break through the impasse and get some progress with her husband. They had some work to do.
I love your commentary. No, you're totally right. Like, I think that's a very, like every time we would sort of do an interview where it would be the two of them and they'd be talking to each other, they would go through years of their lives where especially, when we were there, or sometimes weeks that would go by where they'd be on different time schedules. She'd be playing pickleball. Reggie would be, doing something stoned probably somewhere. And, they wouldn't eat dinner. They would sometimes.
He was the yogi.
Yeah, they would go through days and weeks and months sometimes without really like having a tried and true conversation. So I think when we would do those types of interviews, I would go into it kind of letting them know I was going to ask them some intense questions. But I think weirdly it was like the joy and the tension and all the things that came out of those interviews that you sort of see in the film I think in some ways, I mean, I don't want to take credit at all for
No, you were their
the
therapist.
relationship,
There's no
but
question in my mind.
there
No,
was a
there
little
was.
bit of that, you know, as they were for me, because off camera, you know, I think that was another, at the time I made this film, I was going through a breakup of my own, and I was questioning all forms of questions about whether like everlasting love could exist and things like that. So, you know, I think that part of the relationship we had, I would be asking them for advice, and then not that they would be asking me for advice, but it was more just having someone there to talk about things with.
No, there's some scenes where you see Reggie sort of looking at what she's saying as if he'd never heard anything like it before. Like it was like revelatory to him. And I was like, whoa, this is great. So I want to go back a little bit to how you got the movie made. You went to Harvard, right?
I did, yes.
So you studied there. What did you study at Harvard exactly?
I studied documentary filmmaking there in this program. I think they have a new title for it now, but when I was there, it was called Visual and Environmental Studies, which is, you know, who knows what that means, but for me, it meant a lot. That was really my training ground. You know, there's a lot of amazing filmmakers that teach there. There's a whole kind of branch of ethnographic filmmaking that is made there. And, you know, when I was in college, I was making short films. Not a lot of people there were making films, so it was a lot easier to get some of the resources to get things going. And this film was actually born out of that program. This was my college thesis that then I worked on for a year after I graduated. But while I was there, I was able to make a bunch of shorts. And after making them, it was almost like I would be testing them in school, and I'd get butchered in my critiques, and everyone would not really like them. And I'd go, oh man, I got to take, you know, some of these notes are really good. I should take them to heart. And then I would keep working, finagling here and there. Then I would submit them to the New York Times op docs. And that relationship too was a really big way of getting this film made. You know, I had made a film prior to this one about a guy living on a cruise ship for 20 years. He's a passenger, a retiree, and his kind of escapist, isolationist thinking is very much the same sort of thinking that exists in the villages. So there was a lot of sort of experimentation that I was able to do with this in short form before going to making a feature.
Well, you did make a really beautiful movie, even if I didn't get to see it on the big screen. There's some great images, some great setups. You know, you play around with all the golf carts lining up and all the dance moves and so on. And tell me how you and your cinematographer managed to get some of those sort of beauty shots that you got.
Well, I think, you know, going back to the thinking of just, you know, there are plenty of documentaries that are able to transcend, I guess, what you normally think of, like the more journalistic way of making a film. I think, like, to me, in my cinematographer, David Boland, we always subscribe to this idea of that, you know, the documentaries as being the creative treatment of reality or whatever. And in our case, it was like, you know, we wanted to make something. I think the closest thing that we were thinking about, there was a photographer named Larry Sultan who had this amazing series that he did with his retired parents in San Fernando Valley in the 80s. And he talks about how he would sort of riff off of reality. He would take real situations, and then, you know, would essentially, in some ways, he'd set up a shot and have those situations in some ways be like recreated. You know, so in our case, it was with the golf cart drill team. It'd be something, an image that we would see without a camera, and I would then go and reapproach those people and say, hey, can we do exactly what you normally would do, but, you know, I may give you some pointers here and there just to get, you know, to kind of get there.
You choreographed that a little.
Of course. Well, I think there's elements, you know, especially with the clubs. It's like there's the choreographer who is actually choreographing the thing, and then there is me and my cinematographer and the sound person in the background. And sometimes we'll mess up the shot and we'll ask people to do things over again. But for the most part, I think like the reasoning behind that, or the reason we wanted to make a film in this sort of way, is in some ways that's exactly when you're in the villages, that's exactly what the place feels like. Everything has been sort of handpicked. You know, the nature of
They
I
made
don't
it
know.
look like the 50s, you
Yeah,
know.
the rules of the outside world don't really apply there. It's like you enter a bubble and reality, there's a distortion effect that happens. So I think for us, it was important that we kind of get that feeling of perfection as best as we could, and really have choreographed images and that are all shot on tripod, for example, and really get people and kind of let them experience the place for themselves.
And I think it's good that you weren't heavy-handed about it, because I think you do come away after you've seen the whole thing with a sense that it's a little bit like Edward Scissorhands, you know, the sort of suburban choreographed
Oh,
place
music to my ears. That was, yeah, I love
that
that.
does
It's like one of my favorite movies.
that doesn't that you have to be a conformist in order to function there, and so there is a commentary, there is a kind of Republican conformist commentary here, and you're drawn to the ones who stick out. And the woman who I found very moving, I found it interesting that you picked her, the single woman, the widow,
Right.
with the attraction to the tequilas. I think she liked tequilas,
Yes.
but she was very moving. And I wondered if you thought she was interesting at the beginning for a reason, or whether she wasn't interesting, but you began to realize that she was.
I think, that's a great question. I think in her case, I met her at actually the first place I went to when I first got there was the acting club, because I knew that anybody who was at the acting club would probably not be, they probably would enjoy the camera. And a lot of people had all types of tall tales and amazing stories about their lives. But the person who seemed most in tune with kind of, what she was going through, and when I met her, her husband was still alive, but he was very sick, was Barbara. And she was, I think I could sense that there was a loneliness. There was this, she was the only person I really had met that wished she wasn't there. And I couldn't help but think of, just, yeah, people who are, they make really, they make impulsive decisions in their lives to uproot themselves in an attempt to find a better version of life, and regret that decision. I think that's something that I can very much relate to. And I think it's and also in working with Barbara, given that she does have, and you kind of see it towards the end of the film, she's an amazing performer. I think that's another thing that kind of, that shooting in this sort of way was able to, it was almost like shooting with some form of artifice allowed us to get to some better version of the truth, or some more emotional version of the truth. That I think definitely spoke to Barbara's case, like that performance she gives in her monologue at the end.
Blew me away.
Yeah. I mean, if any, non-documentary filmmakers, narrative filmmakers are watching, please hire Barbara. She's looking to act. And that's something that, I think at the end, I was just like also kind of totally moved by when we filmed it. I was like, wow,
Wow. Yeah.
didn't even know that.
She's interesting because she's somebody who looks so sad, and you would capture that. You would capture her off when she wasn't on, and she would look really down, and then she would come to life in interacting with other people. It was interesting. So tell me about some of the people who have helped you. You have some interesting people to thank, including Soros, who often gives money to documentaries, but it's a good thing. Darren Aronofsky, Lindsay Krause, who I happen to know,
Oh,
and
wow.
Jeff Orlowski.
Yes. It's
Tell
kind
me
of
what's going on with all those people.
It's a motley crew of a bunch of people with a bunch of different, worldviews and tastes and everything of the like. Well, each of them came to the project in different ways. Darren came to the project. I found his email on the internet, and I was very persistent for several years of just trying to get in touch. I have a tendency to do this with, any sort of filmmaker whose account I can find, I will write them. And when Darren's
What are you asking for?
Usually I will send them my work. In this case, I was sending Darren my shorts, but at that time, Darren never read them. And I think he had someone at his production company would eventually go through them, and they had ignored them for years. And then finally there was a change up. There was Brendan Naylor, who's an executive producer on the film, who works with Darren. finally saw one of my emails and was like, you must be crazy. Why are you sending these? Like, please stop. I watched your shorts. They're really impressive. Like, let me know if there's anything else that you're working on. And, so that collaboration came from there. And Darren and Brendan and Ari from Protozoa, and there's a few other people, Kat Hobbs and Elizabeth Gasis. They all, it was an interesting relationship because none of them had really previously worked in documentaries before. And the way they were involved was that they would watch, and specifically Darren would watch, he probably watched 5 or 6 cuts of this film, and gave a lot of really interesting feedback, especially just about how the visual language should work. And there were several versions of the film that kind of, were teetering back between the sort of manicured stuff and then kind of outside of the villages. There was a lot more handheld camera work and things that were less consistent. So he played a big role. Jeffrey Soros and Los Angeles Media Fund, they were really very supportive also in the film. They were kind of our creative capital partners. So they gave us a lot of really great notes, and they also gave us the funding that we needed to make the film with. Lindsay at the OpDocs, I had this film previously started off as a short, and that was kind of I'm very thankful to the New York Times for not, telling me to get lost after I told them that I thought I had something longer here. And then Jeff was my Sundance, he was my mentor at Sundance Ignite. And this was kind of the period where I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I have no clue where to go or how to make this film. And Jeff was very helpful in kind of guiding how to make something. And he's beyond being a very talented filmmaker, and his film, The Social Dilemma, is such a important movie this year. But also he's a very skilled business person and a very skilled producer. So he would kind of give me a lot of pointers of where to go and where not to go and that sort of thing.
So one lesson to be learned from your experience, I suggest, is that being persistent and asking for help is not a bad thing.
No, I mean, it depends, because I think in Lindsay's case too, I found, I was very persistent with that New York Times open submission form. I must have sent like 1 million movies, probably at least 5 until
it's like getting into the New Yorker with a short story.
Yeah, exactly. So, you do have to be persistent. You got to take every no you get with it should just put some more pep in your step, and I think there are certain moments where you have no idea. In this case, there were so many moments where I had no idea if we even had a film. And I think, just continuing to embrace the unknown and having a good, support system around you will help,
That's good. So you got to go to Sundance, which is a big deal to get in. That's like getting into the New Yorker also. So what was that experience like?
I mean, to honestly look back at it now, I'm sure, were you there this past?
I didn't go this year. I went to Berlin. That was my last festival experience.
That must have been nice. Well, I'm sure looking back at anything, like however many months, is that 8 months? No, more than that. Many months ago, it feels like 5 years ago. But at the time, it was a really, I think, I've been a fan of so many films that have gone there. I've been a fan of the festival for so long, and it was a very surreal experience. I don't think I was able to fully process it. Even now, I feel like with the pandemic, I'm just like, did that even happen? That felt like some kind of dream or something that never, that maybe happened, maybe it didn't. I don't know. But I'm very fortunate for having been able to play anywhere before really the festival.
That's right. That's a good thing. And what happened to you as far as your distribution decisions went after that?
Yeah, and that was another thing. Sundance was a very important place to be, just to find a distributor. And Magnolia Pictures was very, they had seen kind of a work in progress before the film was finished, and they've always been extremely supportive. So we're finally, the movie's finally coming out January 15th, which is exciting. And there'll be like a day and date sort of release. And we're trying to do a golf cart drive-in at the Villages, which I very much hope happens if they let us do it. I think that's one of the bittersweet things of releasing a film of any kind right now is obviously there are
in person is difficult. Yeah, and seeing it with an audience is difficult.
But looking behind you, you have the Roma poster. There are certain films that are meant for the big screen that play just as well as the small ones. So
this is also true. What are you up to next?
Oh man, I'm working on a bunch of stuff.
I bet.
Who knows? I'm working on another documentary project, and then I'm also working on a fiction project. So we'll see where the stars align. Hopefully for the next wherever we go in this world.
So after Sundance, you must have gotten you must have an agent already, right?
I do, yeah.
And so did they got you some meetings and they turned into Zoom meetings?
Yeah, all the meetings are Zoom meetings. All the meetings are I wonder, I'm curious if like the way that whole side of the industry works, maybe people are more productive on Zoom meetings than they were before. Sometimes, I feel like the Skype, there's a difference in my mind now between Skype and Zoom. I can tell what kind of person is which. It's usually sometimes more of like an intimate hangout on Skype versus on Zoom, but what do I
In
know?
my experience, no one's using Skype anymore.
I know. Well, I don't know what happened. Skype really had they had their
They blew
moment
it.
in the sun. I know.
So I'm curious to see how things proceed for you. Would you have stayed in Florida without the pandemic, or is that a commitment that you're making?
No, it's interesting. I was coming back and forth here before the pandemic happened. My family lives here. There is a project that the next documentary project I was searching around on is also a story here. So I was kind of spending time already. I was planning on spending probably not as much time, but I was planning on spending time in Miami, and now I'm still in Fort Lauderdale. So go figure. But I feel like Florida politically, and it's a funny state. It went extremely red, but yet we also voted to raise minimum wage. So how do you explain that? I think the only answer is that more people need to make films in Florida, and we just need to consistently figure out what's going on here.
Well, I look forward to whatever you do next, even if it is set in Florida. And thank you for this. I enjoyed our conversation.
Such a pleasure to talk to you.
All right. Thank you, Gabe.
Thank you, Gabe.